Ever since the end of the war, there were demands for an exhibition complex large enough to mount international as well as national events, and having all the modern services and facilities with which to attract exhibitors and visitors from all over the world. Now, thanks to the initiative of the old Birmingham City Council and the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce, and with government support, the nation has at last acquired an exhibition centre which can bear comparison with the best the rest of the world has to offer. I have great pleasure in declaring the National Exhibition Centre open.
At the start of the 70s, Birmingham was Britain's most transatlantic-looking city. It had transatlantic problems too: rising crime, traffic congestion, black ghettos, a growing greed and selfishness perhaps amongst its people. But like Victorian Birmingham of 100 years before, it was a place of schemes and dreams. It was not a city to be ignored. Midland's industry was beset by problems. It was complacent about the threat posed by foreign competition. There was a dangerous lack of investment in the future. And above all, it was hamstrung by ancient and anarchic industrial relations. The 70s began with a flexing of union muscle. In the long run, it was to prove disastrous for the labour movement.
The miners' strike of 1972 was made effective by secondary picketing on a very vigorous and determined scale. Indeed, it was in the course of the 1972 strike that Arthur Scargill won his spurs and developed what he believed to be a very effective way of winning industrial disputes, as of course it was, unless he's up against a government rather more determined than he faced at that time.
The miners, particularly those from Yorkshire, were militant, well organised and determined to succeed.
You can ask the police, and unfortunately they will confirm what I'm saying. There is no lorry gone through here today. I'm not telling you any lies. No lies. At all. And I'm assure you, if you turn around on this picket line...
Secondary picketing then was the name of the game, and that meant, in the context of that miners' strike, actually stopping power stations.
Providing there's no lorries gone in. Only as I say, we're self-employed, so we can't join the union.
Birmingham Trades Council gave support, and workers marched from under their union banners from Longbridge in order to give their support to the miners effectively besieging Saltley. The police eventually decided on public order and public safety grounds that they could no longer keep the depot open, and it was closed. In terms of winning the strike, it was probably symbolic more than actual. It wasn't that the shutting down of Saltley meant that the government had to concede, but it was a great symbolic victory, particularly as it was fought out under the eye of the TV cameras.
At the time of the 1970 motor show, the home industry had been buoyant. It was breaking records for production and exports. There was alarm that 1 car in 5 being bought in Britain was foreign. Austin Morris introduced the Marina as a holding action from Cowley and followed it up 3 years later with Longbridge's Car for Europe, the Allegro. It might have been a success had it not been competing with its sister, the Marina, had the government not insisted on companies expanding only in development areas, had the workforce been happy. But the end result was that Birmingham's car industry was steadily becoming uncompetitive.
There is no agreement about how far the workers were responsible for this. On the whole, my own view is that incompetent management was the fundamental reason for the decline of the British car industry and the Birmingham car industry overall, but that militant and well-organised workers did move into the vacuum presented by the failure and even, we could say, the abdication of management.
By the 1975 motor show, British Leyland had been renamed and reorganised. But even a massive injection of public money, nationalisation in effect, didn't seem to be slowing the slide into bankruptcy.
We, as a company, have just ended our financial year. We made a thundering great loss. There's no way we can allow that to carry on, and this is really what all the manpower reduction is all about. My management team fully support me, and I believe that our total workforce are going to support our management team in ensuring that we do not make a thundering great loss in this financial year that we're now in.
It wasn't only car companies that were being streamlined. The 1974 local government reorganisation brought Royal Sutton Coldfield into the city, giving Chelmsley Wood to Solihull. The markets too had kept in step with Birmingham's march from obscure manor to England's second city. They hung on to their traditional sites far longer than was really practical for a modern city, even though by now there was an inner ring road. So by 1974, when really it would have been better for the wholesale markets to be moved out of the city, instead they were rebuilt and housed under one roof in the centre.
Generally, we like it very, very much. It's a far better market than ever we envisaged. And with our system of trunk roads, I think Birmingham will be one of the finest markets in the country.
Like the old market used to be. The old market, you got more like an atmosphere, like, you know, where you could... Well, it was a better market, prices were better and things like this, like, you know, but I think it's too spaced out too much. You can't make it into a market. It's more of a cash and carry at the moment.
Difficult to get in and out of Birmingham to get at it. Deliverers from it are awkward. It's the wrong thing in the wrong place. There's a white elephant is going to become a monument to somebody's late planning.
In that same year, there were other, more sinister forces planning to alter the shape of Birmingham. And on a night in November, war returned to the city centre.
I was just standing with about 4 friends, and there was the flash and the blast, which seemed to, just go on and on.
Just 6 minutes after a telephone warning to the Birmingham Post and Mail, a bomb exploded in the Mulberry Bush, a pub built into the base of the rotunda. The force of the blast blew a 3-foot hole through the concrete floor, which was 10 inches thick, and blew much of the pub into the street, where the bodies of 2 youths were later found under a pile of debris. Rescue services and taxi cabs from New Street Station took the injured to hospitals. At the General Hospital, 50 doctors and nearly 200 nurses dealt with the carnage. Minutes later, a second bomb went off at the Tavern in the Town, a basement pub under the New Street Tax Office. A third bomb, planted in the Hagley Road, failed to go off. People fleeing the city centre in panic were thought to be the bombers. 21 people died in the 2 pubs.
It was like a nightmare, I must admit. I was under this rubble and I was trying to get out, and I thought I'd be trapped there, and my legs were trapped. But my boyfriend eventually managed to get all the rubble off me, and we managed to clamber upstairs. He was covered in blood and I was covered in blood. I think it was more other people's blood than our own, luckily.
What sort of injuries have you got?
Got a fractured cheekbone. All the rest are just superficial.
Nobody who, like me, was in Birmingham that night can forget the atmosphere that gripped the city. The IRA had begun its bombing campaign here more than a year before. Yet even though a bomb disposal officer had been killed, nobody really thought it could happen to them. The events of the night of November the 21st, 1974, changed all that. And once more, Birmingham found itself having to deal with a problem that was not of its own making. The most immediate problem was controlling the backlash against the Irish community. Longbridge workers held a spontaneous walkout demanding hanging for bombers, while a handful of Irish properties were petrol bombed. This city has an unfortunate, if well-deserved, reputation for putting cars before people and for large-scale redevelopment every 20 years or so. It's not surprising that Birmingham should have had a large Irish community, many attracted by the abundant building work from the 18th century onwards. In the early 1970s, these bold navigators built several new roads linked to the recently opened Spaghetti Junction, cementing Birmingham even more into the motorway network. On a bleak day in February 1976, the Queen came to Birmingham to open the 5 halls of the giant National Exhibition Centre on a site which 6 years before had been farmland. The South had scoffed. How could the provinces compete with Olympia and Earl's Court? But back in 1970, the government had funded Birmingham to the tune of £1.5 million. All there was to show for their faith was a sign in a field. But Birmingham City provided £40 million, and 5 years later it was all taking shape. The Prime Minister came to see how it was going. The city fathers showed off their pride and joy. A year later, the first successful spring fair and a regal inauguration by remote control of the 200-foot fountain on the frozen waters of Lake Pendigo. And a much-needed touch of colour for a very grey day. The flags of 39 nations fluttered in an Arctic breeze. The Queen returned to the city in the summer of 1977 as part of the nationwide celebrations of her Silver Jubilee.
Your adults, you're gradually pushing them forward, they'll have nowhere to walk at
all. But the year was marred by riots described as a national disgrace, which broke out during the run-up to a by-election in August. History had recorded bloodshed at the hustings many times in the past, but the scale of violence which broke out on the streets of Ladywood on the evening of August the 15th surprised everyone. The marchers had been gathered together by members of the Socialist Workers' Party. The target of their demonstration was a National Front meeting. 500 demonstrators converged on the area, and the police found themselves in the middle. For the first time, a provincial force had to shelter behind riot shields as bricks and bottles flew through the air. A timely reminder that the racial issues highlighted by Enoch Powell's Match onto Gunpowder speech could not be ignored, now 40 years after coloured immigrants had first settled in Birmingham. The late Dr. Dani Prem, Birmingham's first Asian councillor in 1945, was here during the war, one of a small community of around 100 Asians.
Well, colour prejudice was still there, perhaps a little stronger than it is now, even though the number of Asians were very small at that time. And most of us who came here came as students originally. Some of them settled down as medical practitioners. And yet, we couldn't get a job in hospitals. We couldn't get jobs in, say, public medical service or anywhere else. We had to depend on the goodwill of the working class people at that time, because we felt as one with them. We were a subject nation. They were also downtrodden here in this country at that time. So the two underdogs went very well together.
The first group of West Indians who stepped off the Empire Windrush in June 1948 felt they were coming home. Some of them had spent the war years in the RAF, and all of them had been brought up to see England as the mother country. Jobs were plentiful. Indeed, many had been recruited in the West Indies before they'd even left. As white workers moved on to the new post-war industries, employers were desperate to fill the gaps that they left. They had little success in recruiting from Europe, but found a ready supply of cheap, amenable labour in the black Commonwealth.
During those days, the gaffers used to come up and ask you if you have got anybody coming from Jamaica. And before that bloke leave Jamaica, a job was assured, because there wasn't much people really want the job at the time that they was offering. More or less, as we are immigrants, we had to take the job that the average white bloke didn't want at the time.
It was often argued that immigration added to the population pressures within the city. Yet between 1951 and 1971, the population figure actually dropped by 100,000. Again, the immigrants were often blamed for poor social conditions in parts of the city, areas where they were only able to move into the decaying houses nobody else wanted, or into lodging houses where they were often exploited by unscrupulous landlords. The new coloured communities were given little opportunity to disperse throughout the city, and the council wasn't keen to go down the road of positive discrimination. The establishment of ghettos, however unintentional, made meeting the social needs much easier, but as the jobs disappeared, so did the pretense of goodwill.
You only get the jobs what the white person doesn't want, you see. We get the leftovers, either the blackies or the Indians. We only get the leftovers, you see. That's why I see it as something to do with the colour, you see, because we're black.
To this background of unemployment and poor housing was added a very real problem of communication between the police and the unemployed British black youth. A problem highlighted in a report entitled Shades of Grey.
You see, in the daytime, there's nowhere to go. You know, people are unemployed, young black boys, they're unemployed, there's nowhere to go. So they have to find somewhere for them to go. Because if there's nowhere for them to go, we just spill out onto the streets, and the police come along and they look at you and they say, yeah, he looks like a likely suspect, let's follow him. And then they pick a little trouble, and maybe if the black boy says something back to them, you know, in the car.
If they're out on the street at night, if in certain circumstances and situations, the policeman must go and speak to them and make inquiries as to what they're doing there. And in other places in this country, it's perfectly acceptable procedure. What we have to do is to make these youngsters understand that that is a perfectly proper police procedure, and that there's nothing ulterior in being spoken to by a policeman, whatever time of day or night it is.
When you read in the papers about the boys, them going around mugging people and all of that, I don't like it. Because sometimes when my son goes out, you know, I feel ever so frightened.
I'm not in control of my kid anymore.
That's it.
Now, as soon as I says to my 16 or 17-year-old boy, I says, look, boy, you should be in 10 o'clock, and you're coming in 12. What's this? Now he says, Dad, I'm leaving home. Now some social, what they call it, social security or national something says,
workers.
You know, they're giving money to find flats and something like that.
That's it.
Now where do I stand? He leave home. Next thing I know, he's some dread or something, and what happens? You know, it brings shame on the family.
The calls for help were to some extent heard, and community leaders, the police and other agencies attempted solutions. But the roots of the problem were deep and would re-emerge with devastating consequences. 1977 saw the end of the line for Birmingham Snow Hill. Its days as a mainline station had come to an end 10 years before. In March 1967, there was a weekend of steam specials, and crowds of enthusiasts bade farewell to castles as if they were kings. Pendennis Castle, now in Australia, was one of the 2 Paddington to Birkenhead trains on that last steam Saturday. The other, Clun Castle, which now graces Birmingham's Railway Museum at Tyseley, did a similar run the next day. 5 years to the week, the station closed to all traffic. The last train made a unique journey from Snow Hill to New Street. Another 5 years passed, and the bulldozers moved in. It was a good year for the demolition men. Just 2 miles down the line from Snow Hill, they were burying BSA.
I saw the place built in 1914-18 war. I've been connected with BSA since 1919 as a worker, and to see it built up, I never thought I'd live to see the day of its disintegration like it is. And every time I look at it, last Sunday morning when I heard the hammer banging into the wall, that's another part of my life gone.
The death throes of the British motorcycle industry were long and painful. Takeovers, mergers, and even workers' cooperatives were tried to resuscitate it. Nothing worked, and as a would-be saviour Tony Benn was defined, self-interest was a chronic disease.
Ridiculous money for producing the same motorbike as us. They've done the cells. They've got the cells to blame. They'll do it again. We've been over to try them. I went myself. They're that good, they wouldn't even give you a cup of tea.
If that is true, then that is the worst news I've heard today for Small Heath itself. Yes, all right, I say that sincerely, because if workers, as we enter into a situation when there may be some sort of a world recession, if workers react by saying that our real enemies are the men down the road who've also got work when our jobs are threatened, and vice versa, then quite frankly, the prospects of us overcoming these difficulties are very much reduced.
The real enemies were not down the road, but in Japan, where their motorcycle industry was booming.
I don't think I can put it into words. When you think back of this company and how the Germans tried to destroy it during the war, and the Japanese, overnight, without lifting a finger, you see this place coming down in ruins. And the unemployment in this area, with the Labour government in, I say words can't describe what I feel.
Social contract out were the words that described how they felt at British Leyland. In early 1977, there was a succession of strikes at Longbridge, the most damaging those by the tool makers. Lord Ryder's plan foundered, and an approach was made to Michael Edwards to make sense of the chaos. By the time of Birmingham's first NEC motor show in October 1978, Edwards had begun his recovery plan. It involved the loss of 12,500 jobs and the closure of several factories. There were other forces to be reckoned with besides the unions. The Japanese had been making steady inroads into car markets throughout the decade, although at this show, the car of the year was a Porsche. The first show at the NEC was a big success. It silenced forever the critics who said that people wouldn't travel away from London to look at new motor cars. Such were the crowds, a one-way system had to be set up in the main car hall, and the unopened section of the nearby M42 was used as a car park. All previous attendance records for motor shows were smashed. But behind all the gloss and the glitter was the spectre of Britain's appalling record of labour relations in the car industry. There were no new cars on the Ford stand because of a dispute at Dagenham. Sir Barry Heath spelled it out.
Let us grasp the nettle. The failure of the British motor industry would mean the failure of the Midlands. There is no simple solution. There is no person or party who can put these things right overnight. It has to be a colossal joint effort by all of us, and it must be done.
Michael Edwards was one man determined that it must be done, and that meant head-on confrontation with the communist convener Derek Robinson, who had already played no small part in smashing the social contract. The issue at stake: who was running British Leyland?
We aim to begin a campaign to reverse the disastrous policy that Edwards is pursuing, a policy that will lead to not only the decline of British Leyland, but its ultimate extinction.
There is no doubt that Robinson was essentially sacked for propounding his own alternative strategy to that devised by Edwards, which clearly involved both great reduction in the workforce, introduction of not only of new technology, but of greatly streamlined industrial relations.
It's not me that's been sacked. In reality, it's the whole of the trade union movement that's under threat as a result of the company's action to one individual, namely myself.
Been official for the last hour, T&G.
Robinson was suspended on full pay. As time passed, it became clear that support for him was by no means universal. Many of the transport and general workers in particular were not even impressed by their own official pickets, let alone those of Robinson's union, the AUEW.
Nobody dictates to me, and I can see nobody dictates to you.
With Michael Edwards warning that he would close the Austin down if a strike was called, and he'd already done that at Speak, a mass meeting voted against support for Derek Robinson. The sacking and Edwards' recovery plan both went through.
Today's mass meeting was not a vote in favour of Ray Horrocks or Harold Musgrove or the board of Austin Morris or the board of BL. Today's vote was a vote that said, we want to work. As simple as that. Unemployment, jobs will be the main issue of the next 4 or 5 years in this country and others. This is the ordinary chap saying, we want to work.
The reason Edwards had to win was this: the company's tiny new flagship, the Metro, unveiled in 1979 as a successor to the Austin 7 and the Mini. The unions were temporarily paralysed, and there was a new style of government under Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. BL's management moved quickly to capitalise on the new economic and political climate. 70,000 jobs were shed. Each new robot line replaced 70 car workers.
Products here, whether in cars or components, a very successful and profitable show. If it's successful and profitable for you, it'll be very good for me too.
Endorsed at the highest level, the Metro as a car went from strength to strength. But as the company cut prices to stay in the market, profits continued to fall.
Some years ago, people were prepared to write off this company and its employees. And I believe that with Metro, we've proved that we are a force to be reckoned with in the motor industry. I believe now that we have to penetrate even deeper into Europe with Metro and with Maestro, and with the new cars that will be coming through next year as well. So there's reason for some optimism, but no room for complacency whatsoever.
He was putting a brave face on the real situation. In 1969, the West Midlands Economic Planning Council had warned that too much dependence was placed on the motor industry and its component manufacturers. Then there had been 3 jobs for every person seeking work. In 1983, there were 30 people for every job. As Christmas approached, the lights in the high street couldn't dispel the gloom, as yet another city centre shop fell prey to recession and the Co-op shut its doors for good. Earlier that year, Debenhams too had closed down.
attention, please. The store will be closing in 15 minutes at 4:30. Thank you.
There's no more customers allowed in the store. Thank you. The store is now closed. You may as well leave. Thank you.